My name is Adrian, I am 32 years old, and until last year, I thought my life was moving exactly in the direction. I always wanted. I had a stable job, a small house that I worked years to afford, and a girlfriend named Lavra, who I had been with for almost 5 years. When we first met, Lavra was charming, energetic, and the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make everyone feel comfortable. We met through a mutual friend at a birthday party, and by the end of the night, we had spent hours talking about everything from music to travel to our plans for the future. Within a few months, we were inseparable, and for the first 2 years of our relationship, I honestly believed I had found the person I would eventually marry. Lavra moved into my house after about a year because it made sense financially and emotionally, and for a while everything felt like the normal progression of a serious relationship. We shared expenses, we planned small trips together, and we even talked occasionally about getting engaged someday. But around the 3rd year of our relationship, something began to feel different. At first the changes were small. Lavra started spending more time on her phone. She became more protective of it, and she would sometimes step into another room to answer messages. When I asked about it, she said she was just talking to co-workers or friends, and I believed her because I had no reason not to trust the person I had been building a life with. However, the small things slowly started adding up. She began coming home later from work, sometimes saying she had stayed late for meetings or team dinners, which was believable because she worked in marketing and her company often had events. But the pattern continued getting stranger. She became distant emotionally. Conversations that once lasted hours turned into short, distracted responses. She stopped showing interest in the hobbies we used to share, and whenever I tried to talk about it, she would tell me I was overthinking things and that work had just been stressful for her. 4 months, I convinced myself that was the truth, because the alternative would mean something much worse. Eventually, one evening, everything changed. I had gotten home early from work because a project had been finished ahead of schedule. When I walked into the house, Lavra was not there, which was normal because she usually came home later. But what caught my attention was that her laptop was sitting open on the dining table. The screen had a messaging application open, and I noticed my name in one of the conversations. I was not trying to spy, but seeing my name made me look closer. What I read next felt like someone had punched me in the chest. The conversation was between Lavra and a man named Nathan, who I later discovered worked in her office. They were not just flirting, they were talking about their relationship, probably about how they had been seeing each other 4 months and about how she was waiting for the right moment to leave me. She even wrote that living in my house made things easier financially until she figured out her next step. I remember just standing there staring at the screen for several minutes because my brain could not process what I was seeing. 5 years of memories suddenly felt different, like every moment had been rewritten with a darker meaning. My first reaction was anger, but after the anger came something colder. I realized that confronting her immediately would probably lead to denial, excuses, or manipulation, so instead, I quietly closed the laptop and pretended I had never seen it. When Lavra came home later that evening, she greeted me with the same casual smile she always used, and asked how my day was as if nothing had changed. That moment made something inside me shift completely, because I now knew that the person standing in front of me was capable of lying to my face without hesitation. For the next 2 weeks I acted completely normal. I did not confront her, I did not accuse her of anything. Instead, I started quietly preparing my exit and my revenge. I gathered copies of every message and conversation from her laptop. Whenever she left it unattended, I documented dates, times, and screenshots of her conversations with Nathan. I also contacted my lawyer because the house was entirely in my name, and I wanted to make sure that legally I could remove her from the situation without complications. Meanwhile, Lavra continued living in my house pretending everything was normal. She even continued talking about future plans, sometimes mentioning vacations we might take or restaurants we should try, which only made the situation feel more surreal. Once I had everything prepared, I decided it was time for the final step. I planned a small dinner at the house and invited a few close friends, including one of Lavra's closest friends, Emily, who had always been supportive of our relationship. Lavra had no idea what was Coming that evening, she thought it was just a normal dinner gathering. When everyone arrived, we sat down and started eating and talking casually. After about 30 minutes, I stood up and said, I wanted to share something important with everyone. Lavra looked slightly confused, but not worried yet. Then I connected my laptop to the television in the living room and opened a folder filled with screenshots of the messages between her and Nathan. The room went completely silent as the messages appeared on the screen, one for another, revealing months of lies, cheating, and conversations about how she planned to use my house until it was convenient to leave. Lavra's face turned pale. Almost immediately, she tried to interrupt and say that the messages were being taken out of context, but there was no context that could change what everyone was seeing. Emily looked shocked and disappointed, while the rest of our friends sat there in disbelief. Once the final screenshot appeared, I calmly explained that Lavra would need to move out of the house within the week because the relationship was over and the house legally belonged to me. Lavra started crying and accusing me of humiliating her in front of everyone, but I reminded her that the humiliation came from her own actions, not from the truth being revealed. By the end of the night, most of our friends had quietly left and Lavra packed a small bag and went to stay somewhere else. Within a few days, she had moved out completely and moved in with Nathan. From what I heard later, their relationship did not last very long once the excitement of the secret affair disappeared. Now months have passed and my life has slowly returned to normal. Some people told me that exposing her like that was too harsh and that I should have handled the breakup privately, but others say that someone who lies 4 months while using their partner financially should not expect a gentle ending. Sometimes I still wonder if the way I handled it was too extreme, but at the same time part of me believes that after years of loyalty and trust being betrayed, I had every right to reveal the truth. So now I still find myself asking, was I wrong for exposing my cheating girlfriend in front of our friends after discovering the truth about her secret relationship? My name is Caleb. I am 34 years old, and until last year was supposed to marry a woman named Olivia, who I had been with for almost 4 years. When we first met, Olivia seemed like the kind of person who made life exciting. She was confident, funny, and incredibly social, and she had a way of making every situation feel like an adventure. We met at a friend gathering and ended up talking most of the night about travel goals, career plans, and the kind of future we both imagined for ourselves. Our relationship moved quickly, but it felt natural. Within a year, we were living together and talking seriously about marriage and family. When I proposed to her during a weekend trip, she said yes immediately, and for a moment, I truly believed we were starting the happiest chapter of our lives. But the problems started almost immediately after the engagement, especially once wedding planning began. At first, the excitement seemed normal. Olivia wanted to look at venues, try different cake flavors, and plan decorations, which I expected, because weddings are a big event. But what started as excitement slowly turned into something else. The wedding stopped feeling like something we were planning together, and instead started feeling like a massive production where every detail had to impress people. Olivia became extremely focused on appearances. She constantly talked about how the wedding needed to be unforgettable, and how everyone would be talking about it for years, her parents especially. Her mother Karen became deeply involved in the planning process, and almost every decision we made had to go through her approval first. The guest list, which I imagined would be around 80 people, suddenly grew to more than 200 guests, many of whom I had never met. When I questioned it, Olivia said they were important family connections, and that it would look bad if they were not invited. The budget also started growing in ways that made me uncomfortable. Originally, we agreed on something reasonable, but within a few months the costs had doubled because Olivia insisted on a luxury venue, her professional lighting, a live band, elaborate decorations, and expensive catering. Whenever I tried to suggest simplifying something, she would accuse me of not caring about our wedding or not wanting to give her the celebration she deserved. Despite the arguments, I kept telling myself that wedding stress makes people act differently, and that once the event was over things would calm down. However, as the months passed, I started noticing other strange things. Olivia began spending more time on social media, talking about the wedding, posting pictures of decorations, dresses, and venues, while constantly mentioning how expensive everything was and how much work she was putting into it. At first I thought she was just sharing her excitement, but eventually I realized she was also subtly encouraging people to talk about gifts. She would post things like reminders that weddings are expensive or jokes about how generous guests usually are at big celebrations. I felt uncomfortable with that, but whenever I mentioned it, she brushed it off as harmless humor. About 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that changed everything. One evening, home early, and overheard Olivia on the phone in the other room. She was speaking with her mother, and they were discussing the wedding in detail. At first the conversation sounded normal, but then I heard something that made me stop in the hallway. Her mother asked if the guest contribution list was ready, and Olivia replied that she had already estimated what most people would give as wedding gifts. She explained that some guests were likely to give large amounts because of their jobs, and others might need reminders because they usually give less. My stomach dropped when I realized they had actually created a list predicting how much money each guest would bring as a gift, and they were planning parts of the reception around encouraging people to be generous. I quietly walked away before she noticed me because I needed time to process what I had heard that night. I could barely sleep because the wedding suddenly felt less like a celebration of love and more like a financial opportunity for them. The next day I confronted Olivia about the conversation. She initially denied everything, but eventually admitted that her family always estimated gifts at weddings because it helped balance the cost of the event. When I said that felt manipulative, she became defensive and accused me of not understanding her family traditions. The argument lasted hours and ended with both of us angry, but agreeing to move forward because the wedding was already so close. However, a few days later, one of my closest friends, who was also one of my groomsmen, called me and asked if everything was okay with the wedding. He sounded uncomfortable and eventually explained that Olivia had privately contacted several members of the wedding party, asking them to consider giving more generous gifts because the event had become extremely expensive. Hearing that confirmed everything I had suspected. The wedding had become a spectacle where the focus was money and appearances instead of the relationship itself. I tried talking to Olivia again, hoping she would understand why this bothered me, but the conversation turned into the worst argument we had ever had. She said I was embarrassing her and sabotaging the wedding. After months of planning, her mother called me later and said I needed to stop questioning their decisions because weddings are supposed to be grand celebrations for family and community. That was the moment something finally clicked in my mind. I realized that if I ignored this situation and went through with the marriage, the same pattern of control and financial pressure would probably continue 4 years. So a week before the wedding, I made the hardest decision of my life. I told Olivia I could not go through with the marriage. She reacted with shock, anger, and eventually tears, accusing me of humiliating her and destroying everything she had worked for. Her parents called me repeatedly, demanding explanations and saying I had ruined their family reputation because hundreds of guests had already been invited and deposits had been paid. The news spread quickly among friends and relatives, and many people took sides. Some believed I should have gone through with the wedding because cancelling it so late caused financial losses and embarrassment. Others said that discovering those plans before the marriage probably saved me from much bigger problems later. Now months have passed and I have had time to reflect on everything that happened. Sometimes I still feel guilty about how suddenly everything ended, but at the same time I cannot ignore the feeling that the wedding revealed deeper issues about priorities, trust, and values that might have made the marriage unhappy from the beginning. So even now I still ask myself the same question: did I make the right decision by cancelling the wedding when I realized it was becoming more about money and appearances than about the relationship itself? Or was I wrong for walking away at the last moment after so much had already been planned? My name is Marcus. I am 33 years old, and until last year I believed I was about to become a father and start the kind of family life I had always wanted. The woman was named Natalie. and we had been together for almost 5 years when we met. She was warm, thoughtful, and incredibly supportive of my goals. We met through a co-worker at a small weekend barbecue and spent most of that evening talking about everything from movies to travel dreams, and even what kind of future we wanted someday. Our relationship moved slowly at first, but it felt strong and stable. We both worked full-time, and after about 2 years, we moved into a small apartment together. Eventually we upgraded to a small house that I had saved 4 years to buy, and at that point it really felt like we were building something real together. Natalie often talked about wanting a family someday, and I agreed because I had always imagined being a father one day. So when she told me she was pregnant, I was shocked, but also excited. I remember the moment clearly. She came into the living room, holding a pregnancy test with tears in her eyes, and told me we were going to have a baby. My first reaction was nervous laughter, because it felt surreal, but after a few minutes the excitement started to take over. We hugged for a long time, and started talking about how our lives were about to change over the next few weeks. Everything seemed normal. We talked about doctor appointments, possible baby names, and even started discussing how we might turn the small guest room into a nursery. Our families were excited too, especially Natalie parents, who immediately started talking about helping with the baby. However, as time passed, small things began to feel strange. Natalie started becoming very private about certain things, especially her phone. She had never been secretive before, but suddenly she would keep it with her constantly, and would step outside sometimes to take calls. When I asked about it, she usually said it was just her friends checking in about the pregnancy, and at first I believed her, because it seemed like a normal thing for friends to do, but the strange feeling never fully went away. Another thing that started bothering me was how little interest she showed in involving me in some of the medical appointments. She would sometimes say the appointments were quick, and there was no need for me to miss work to attend, which I accepted at first, but eventually it started to feel like I was being kept slightly outside of something that should have involved both of us. Around the 4th month of the pregnancy, something happened that changed everything. One evening, was looking for a document on our shared computer, and while searching through files, I accidentally opened a folder that contained several scanned documents. At first I thought they were medical records, but when I looked closer I realized they were messages and emails printed into documents. The messages were between Natalie and another man named Daniel, who I had never heard of before. As I read through the conversation, my heart started racing, because the messages revealed that Natalie had been seeing Daniel several times during a period a few months before she told me about the pregnancy. In those messages, she talked about feeling confused about her relationship and mentioned that she had not told me everything about what was going on in her life. What made my stomach drop was when Daniel asked if she was sure about the timeline of the pregnancy, and Natalie replied that she believed the baby was probably mine, but she could not be completely certain because the dates were close. I remember sitting there staring at the screen, feeling like the room had suddenly gone silent. The excitement and happiness I had been feeling about becoming a father instantly turned into confusion, anger, and fear. I closed the files and spent the next few hours trying to calm down, because confronting her while I was overwhelmed would probably lead to a chaotic argument later that night. When Natalie came home to her direct leave, there was something she needed to tell me about the pregnancy. At first, she looked confused, but when I mentioned the name Daniel, her face changed immediately. She tried to explain that it had only been a short period where she felt unsure about our relationship, and that it had ended quickly. But when I asked the question that mattered the most, whether she knew for certain that the baby was mine, she could not give a clear answer. She said she believed it was mine, but she had never taken a test to confirm it. Hearing that felt like the ground had disappeared under my feet, because for months I had been planning my future around becoming a father, and suddenly I realized that the truth might be completely different. The argument that followed lasted almost the entire night. She cried and apologized repeatedly, saying she had been scared to tell me the full story because she was afraid of losing the relationship, and she believed that once the baby arrived everything would work itself out. But to me the issue was not just the possibility that the baby might not be mine. The deeper Betrayal was that she had known about the uncertainty from the beginning and still allowed me to believe everything was simple and clear. Over the next few days, I barely slept and spent hours thinking about what the right decision would be eventually. I told Natalie that the only way forward was to take a paternity test. Once the baby was born, she agreed, but the trust between us had already been shattered. During the remaining months of the pregnancy, our relationship felt completely different. Conversations became short and careful, and the excitement that once surrounded the idea of becoming parents had disappeared. When the baby was finally born, we arranged for the test. As soon as it was possible, those days waiting for the results felt like some of the longest days of my life. When the results finally arrived, they confirmed that the baby was not mine. Natalie broke down crying when we read the reports, while I felt a strange mix of relief, sadness, and anger. Relief that the uncertainty was over, sadness for the child who had done nothing wrong, and anger about the months of deception that had led to this moment. Shortly after that, Natalie moved out of the house and eventually contacted Daniel to tell him the truth about the situation. From what I later heard, he stepped in and accepted responsibility for the child, but the entire experience left me questioning how easily trust can be broken and how difficult it can be to rebuild once it disappears. Some people in our shared circle of friends said I should have been more forgiving because Natalie had clearly been afraid and overwhelmed, while others said that hiding something so serious for months was a betrayal that no relationship could survive. Even now, sometimes I still replay those moments in my head, wondering if there was a way the situation could have been handled differently, or if the truth would always have led to the same ending. And sometimes I still find myself asking whether walking away from the relationship, never discovering the truth, made me heartless, or whether it was the only decision that allowed me to protect myself from a life built on uncertainty and deception. My name is Victor. I am 36 years old, and about a year ago, I really went through something that completely destroyed the relationships between several relatives and changed the way I look at the money, loyalty, and family forever. It all started when my grandfather, named Alfred, passed away. He was a quiet but incredibly hardworking man who built a successful construction business from nothing over several decades. He was respected by almost everyone who knew him, just because of the money he made, but because he treated people fairly and helped many relatives when they were struggling. Growing up, I spent a lot of time with him because my parents both worked long hours. So many weekends were spent at his house helping him with small projects, listening to his stories and learning practical skills that most people my age bothered with. My cousins, however, had a very different relationship with him. They visited mostly during holidays and special events, but rarely spent time helping him or checking on him when he got older, especially my cousin Derek, who was always chasing quick ways to make money and had a reputation in the family for starting business ideas that never lasted long. Another cousin named Olivia was similar in a different way. She cared deeply about appearances and status and often talked about the lifestyle she believed she deserved because of the family name. Despite this, my grandfather never spoke badly about them. He simply treated everyone equally and avoided family drama whenever possible. During the last few years of his life, his health slowly declined, and I started visiting him more frequently, sometimes several times a week, just to make sure he was comfortable and had what he needed. We would talk about everything from old business stories to simple everyday things, and occasionally he would ask about the future of the family business, which had been sold years earlier, but still represented a big part of his legacy. One afternoon, about 6 months before he passed away, he surprised me by bringing up the topic of inheritance directly. He said he had spent a lot of time thinking about how to divide his assets because he wanted to make sure his final decisions reflected the people who had truly been part of his life, rather than just those who expected something because of family connections. I told him that whatever he decided was his choice, and that I had never helped him because I expected anything in return, but he simply smiled and said that actions always reveal who people really are. When he passed away, the funeral brought the entire family together, including relatives I had not seen in years. everyone spoke kindly about him and shared stories, but beneath the surface, I could already sense tension, because everyone knew he had left behind a significant amount of money and property. A few weeks later, the family gathered again at the lawyer office for the reading of the will. The room was filled with quiet anticipation as the lawyer began explaining the details. At first, everything sounded fairly standard. Some money was left to charities he had supported for years, and a portion was divided among several family members for educational funds for younger relatives. But then the lawyer reached a section that changed everything. The majority of my grandfather's personal savings and the ownership of a small but valuable piece of land were left to me. When the lawyer finished reading that section, the room became completely silent for several seconds before Derek suddenly stood up and demanded to know why I had received such a large portion of the inheritance. Olivia immediately joined him, saying that it made no sense because the family had always believed everything would be divided equally among the grandchildren. The lawyer calmly explained that my grandfather had left a letter explaining his decision, and that it specifically mentioned my frequent visits and support during his later years. The letter described how much those moments had meant to him and how he wanted to reward the person who had consistently shown genuine care out of an obligation. Hearing that explanation only made things worse. Derek accused me of manipulating an old man while he was vulnerable, and Olivia claimed that I must have pressured him into changing the will, even though everyone in the room knew that my grandfather had always been strong-willed and impossible to control. The argument escalated quickly, and eventually the lawyer had to ask everyone to calm down because the will was legally binding and there was nothing to debate. After that meeting, several relatives stopped speaking to me entirely. Derek, in particular, became extremely hostile and started telling other family members that I had stolen what should have belonged to everyone equally. He even suggested challenging the will in court, although the lawyer later confirmed that the document was extremely solid and had been prepared carefully to avoid legal disputes. Over the following months, the family division became more obvious. Gatherings stopped happening, and conversations that once felt normal turned into awkward silences whenever my name was mentioned. Eventually, I sold the piece of land that my grandfather had left me because maintaining it would have required more time than I could realistically give, and I used part of the money to pay off my house and invest in my future, which ironically was exactly the kind of responsible planning my grandfather had always encouraged. But even after a year, the tension within the family has never fully disappeared. Some relatives quietly admit that my grandfather's decision made sense based on who actually spent time with him, while others continue believing that inheritance should always be divided equally regardless of relationships or effort. Sometimes I still feel conflicted because I never wanted money to be the reason my family fell apart, yet at the same time I know that my grandfather made his decision with a clear mind and a lifetime of experience. Watching how each person behaved now, when I look back at everything that happened, I cannot help wondering whether accepting the inheritance and moving forward with my life made me selfish in the eyes of my family, or whether the real issue was that the situation revealed truths about loyalty and entitlement that had been hiding beneath the surface of our family for years. My name is Daniel. I am 30 years old, and about a year ago I was turned upside down because of something that started as a small misunderstanding on social media, but slowly turned into a massive scandal that affected my job, my friendships, and even my reputation with people who had known me for years. Before everything happened, my life was actually very normal. I worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing company, and most of my days were spent working on branding projects for local businesses. The work was not glamorous, but it was stable and I enjoyed the creative aspect of it. Outside of work, I had a small group of close friends and I spent a lot of time online sharing design tips, posting pictures of my projects, and occasionally commenting on trending topics. Like most people who spend time on social media, I never considered myself an influencer or someone with a large following, but over time, my posts slowly started gaining attention, especially from other designers who like seeing the behind-the-scenes process of my work. Eventually my account reached around 20,000 followers, which felt strange to me, because I had never planned on building any kind of audience, was simply sharing things that interested me. The problem started one evening when I posted a short video explaining how some companies use cheap design shortcuts instead of hiring professional designers. It was meant to be a simple educational video where I showed examples of poor logo design and explained why certain shortcuts can damage a brand image. One part of the video I briefly showed a poorly designed logo from a small company as an example of what not to do. I did not mention the company name directly, and the logo was visible for only a few seconds, but somehow someone recognized it and shared the clip with a caption accusing me of publicly mocking a small business owner. Within hours, the post started spreading across several platforms, with people arguing about whether I had crossed a line by using the example. Even though the original video was meant to discuss design principles, the discussion quickly shifted into something completely different. People began claiming that I was attacking small businesses and using my audience to embarrass a struggling company. At first, I thought the situation would calm down if I explained my intention, so I posted a follow-up message saying that the example was never meant to target anyone personally, and that the video was purely educational. Unfortunately, the internet rarely works that way. Instead of calming things down, my explanation attracted even more attention, because some people interpreted it as an attempt to avoid responsibility, while others began digging through my older posts, looking for anything that could be criticized. Within a day, several large accounts reposted clips from the original video, along with dramatic captions suggesting that I had built my online presence by tearing down small businesses. The story spread so quickly that people who had never followed my work started commenting on my page, accusing me of arrogance and bullying. Meanwhile, the owner of the company, whose logo had appeared in the video, eventually posted a message saying that they felt humiliated by the situation, even though I had never intended to target them personally. That message added another layer to the controversy, because now the story had a clear victim and thousands of people online felt the need to defend them against someone they believed had abused their platform. Over the next few days, my notifications became overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers telling me that I should lose my job or disappear from the internet completely. Some comments were simply angry, but others were extremely personal, criticizing my character, my appearance, and even my family, who had nothing to do with the situation. The worst part was that the story eventually reached my workplace. One of my co-workers showed our manager several posts that were circulating online claiming that our company supported someone who bullied small businesses. My manager called me into a meeting to ask what was happening, and although I explained the full situation, he made it clear that the company was worried about its reputation and did not want to become part of a public controversy. For the next week, I tried everything I could think of to calm the situation. I reached out privately to the business owner to apologize directly and offered to redesign their logo for free as a gesture of goodwill. They accepted the apology, but by that point the online conversation had taken on a life of its own. Even after the apology, people continued sharing the story with their own interpretations, adding new details that were not even accurate. Some posts claimed that I had intentionally targeted the company for attention, while others suggested that my entire career had been built on criticizing others. Eventually, the pressure became so intense that I temporarily deactivated my social media accounts just to escape the constant stream of messages and accusations. During that time, focused on my work and tried to move forward, but the experience left a lasting impact on how I view online attention. Before the scandal, I believed that having a moderate audience was simply a fun side effect of sharing my work, but after seeing how quickly a single moment could be taken out of context and amplified by thousands of strangers, I realized how fragile online reputations really are. A few months later, the controversy slowly faded as new topics captured public attention, and eventually I returned to social media with a much smaller and more careful presence, focusing only on design tutorials and avoiding commentary that could be misinterpreted. However, even now some people still recognize my name from the situation and occasionally mention the old controversy, as if it defines everything about me. Sometimes I still wonder whether I handled the situation poorly or whether the entire scandal was simply the result of how quickly narratives can spiral out of control on the internet. What started as a short, educational video became a lesson about how easily public opinion can turn against someone even when the original intention was never to harm anyone. And sometimes I still ask myself whether sharing that example in the first place was truly a mistake, or whether the real issue was the unpredictable nature of social media, where one small moment can suddenly grow into a story far bigger than the person at the center of it ever expected. My name is Nathan, and for most of my life was the kind of person people barely noticed. I was not very confident growing up, and I always felt like was a step behind everyone else, especially when it came to relationships and social life. In high school I was skinny, awkward, and spent most of my time focused on school, or helping my father at his small repair shop instead of going to parties or trying to impress people. Because of that, I never really learned how to present myself with confidence or how to handle people who judged others based on appearances. When I was 23, in a woman named Elena through a mutual friend at a small gathering, she was outgoing, confident, and the kind of person who could easily become the center of attention in any room. When we first started talking, I was honestly surprised. She seemed interested in me because she was surrounded by people who were more charismatic and socially experienced than I was. Somehow we ended up dating, and for a while it felt like my life had finally taken a turn for the better. During the first few months, everything seemed normal. Ayla liked going out to restaurants, meeting friends, and sharing pictures of our activities online, while I was more comfortable with quiet evenings and simple routines. But I tried to adapt because I cared about the relationship. However, as time passed, I started noticing small things that made me uncomfortable. Elena often made jokes about my appearance, especially when we were around her friends. She would laugh and say things like, "Nathan is lucky I gave him a chance, because he would never survive the dating world without me." Sometimes she would comment on my clothes or my posture, saying that I looked like someone who had just walked out of a library instead of someone who should be in a relationship with her. Whenever I tried to laugh it off, she would say she was only joking, but the comments continued happening over and over again. Eventually those jokes began turning into direct criticism. She told me I needed to change the way I dressed, lose the small amount of weight I had gained, and become more social. If I wanted to keep up with her lifestyle, I've tried making small adjustments at first, because I believed relationships require compromise, but nothing ever seemed good enough. Whenever I improved something, she would find something else to criticize. After about 2 years, the relationship started feeling more like a constant evaluation than a partnership, and the breaking point happened at a party hosted by one of her co-workers. During that evening, Elena had been drinking and joking with her friends. While I stood nearby listening, at one point, one of her friends asked how we had started dating, and Elena laughed and said something that I will never forget. She said, "Honestly, I picked him because he seemed safe and easy to control. And besides, someone like him, be grateful anyone like me even looks at him." The room went quiet for a moment before some of her friends awkwardly laughed, but the words stayed in my head long after that night. When we got home, I told her that the comments had hurt me deeply. Instead of apologizing, she said I was being too sensitive and that I should be thankful she had been honest about how she saw the relationship. That conversation ended with her saying that if I wanted to be taken seriously by someone like her, I needed to become a completely different person. Within a few weeks we broke up, and at the time I felt humiliated and angry, but also strangely motivated. For the first time, I realized how much I had allowed someone else's opinion to define my sense of worth. Instead of focusing on the breakup, I decided to focus entirely on improving my life. I started by changing small habits, waking up earlier, exercising regularly, and learning more about personal style and confidence building. At first the changes were difficult because I had never been very disciplined about physical training or social skills, but gradually the effort started showing results. Over the next 2 years, I lost weight, built muscle, improved my posture, and learned how to present myself in a more confident way. I also started taking professional Courses that helped me advance in my career, eventually leading to a better position at a larger company. The biggest change, however, was internal, because the more I worked on myself, the less I cared about proving anything to Elena or anyone else. I simply wanted to become the best version of myself. One afternoon, about 3 years after the breakup, something unexpected happened. I was attending a professional networking event hosted by my company when I heard someone call my name from across the room. When I turned around, I saw Elena standing there looking surprised. She immediately started asking questions about what I had been doing and commented several times about how different I looked. She said I seemed more confident, more successful, and more attractive than she remembered. As we talked, I could sense that she was trying to reconnect in a friendly way, even hinting that we should meet again sometime to catch up. But instead of feeling nervous or eager to impress her, I felt completely calm, because the version of me who once needed her approval no longer existed. I politely told her that I hoped she was doing well, but I had moved on with my life and had no interest in reopening old chapters. She looked disappointed and tried to laugh it off, but I could see that she had not expected that response. As I walked away from that conversation, I realized something important. The real revenge had never been about proving her wrong or making her regret the way she treated me. The real revenge was building a life where her opinion no longer mattered, and where my confidence came from my own growth instead of someone else's validation. Sometimes people who hear the story say that refusing to reconnect with her was harsh, especially since she seemed interested again. But from my perspective, the lesson I learned from that relationship was too important to ignore, and going back would have meant forgetting everything that experience taught me about self-respect and personal growth. So even now, I sometimes ask myself whether walking away from that final conversation was the right decision, or whether I should have simply treated it as a harmless reunion with someone from my past. But deep down, I know that protecting the life and confidence I built after those difficult years was more valuable than reopening a relationship that once made me question my own worth. My name is Lucas, and a few years ago to a new city because I had finally been offered a stable job working in software support for a mid-sized company. The opportunity felt like a major step forward for me, because for most of my early 20s I had been jumping between short-term jobs and struggling to save money. When I moved to the city, I quickly realized that rent was much higher than I expected, and living alone would take most of my paycheck. So I started searching for a roommate situation that could help reduce the cost of living. That was when a mutual acquaintance introduced me to someone named Brandon. He said Brandon was also looking for a roommate, and that we might get along because we were both relatively quiet people. When I first met Brandon, he seemed normal enough. He was friendly, talkative, and confident. He explained that he worked remotely running an online business, and that he liked living in calm environments where he could focus on his work. The apartment he showed me looked clean and organized, and during that first meeting we talked about expectations, like splitting rent equally, cleaning shared spaces, and respecting each other's schedules. Everything sounded reasonable, so within a few weeks we signed the lease together and moved into the apartment. At first the arrangement actually worked well. The first month passed with almost no problems. Brandon mostly stayed in his room, working on his computer, while I followed my routine of going to work, exercising in the evenings, and relaxing at home. The apartment stayed relatively clean, and we occasionally talked in the kitchen about random topics like movies, technology, or things happening in the city. However, small problems started appearing slowly, at first so slowly that I did not think much about them. The beginning, the first issue was dishes. Brandon would cook late at night, that leave his dishes in the sink instead of washing them. I assumed he would clean them the next morning, but sometimes they would stay there for 2 or 3 days until I finally washed them myself just to clear the space. When I mentioned it to him, he laughed and said he had been busy with work and forgot, but promised he would be more careful later. The same pattern continued with trash. Empty food containers and drink cans would appear on the kitchen counter or coffee table and stay there much longer than they should have. Again, when I mentioned it, he apologized casually and promised to improve, But nothing actually changed. After a while, the apartment slowly started feeling less clean, even though I was constantly trying to maintain it. Another strange habit appeared around the second month. Brandon began sleeping during the day and staying awake almost all night. At first I did not mind, because our schedules were different, but eventually it became a problem, because he would start cooking or watching videos loudly at 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes. He would even start vacuuming or moving furniture late at night, which woke me up repeatedly. When I asked if he could keep the noise down during those hours, he said his work schedule required him to be awake at night, and that I needed to be more flexible since we were sharing the space. I tried using earplugs and white noise to adapt, but the constant disruption made it harder for me to rest properly before work. However, the biggest issue started when Brandon began inviting people over. Without warning, the first time it happened, I came home from work and found 3 strangers sitting in the living room, drinking soda and talking loudly. Brandon introduced them as friends who were visiting for a few hours, which seemed harmless. But those visits quickly became more frequent. Sometimes several people would arrive late in the evening and stay until early morning playing music, laughing and arguing about random topics through the walls. I asked Brandon if he could at least send a message before bringing guests so I could prepare, but he brushed it off, saying he did not think it was a big deal since the apartment was his home. As the months passed, the situation became even worse. Brandon started leaving food containers inside his bedroom for long periods of time, which created a strong smell that spread into the hallway. I discovered this accidentally when his door was open one day, and I saw stacks of old takeout boxes on his desk and floor. When I tried to talk to him about it, he laughed and said he would clean everything eventually, but the smell continued appearing again and again despite my efforts to keep shared spaces tidy. The next problem involved money, which was the moment I realized the situation might become serious. One evening, Brandon told me his online business had been experiencing delays in payments and asked if I could temporarily cover his portion of the rent for that month. He promised to repay me within a few weeks since we were already living together, and I wanted to avoid conflicts. I agreed, even though it meant using some of my savings. However, the following month, the same situation happened again. Brandon said another client payment had been delayed and asked for more time. At that point, I started feeling uncomfortable, but he reassured me that things would return to normal soon. Unfortunately, normal never returned. Instead, the excuses continued. Every month, there was always another story about technical problems, payment processing delays, or clients who had not paid him yet. Eventually, I realized that I was covering not only most of the rent, but also utilities, internet, and several other expenses. Whenever I confronted him about the growing debt, he became defensive and said I was stressing him during a difficult time, which made the conversation feel like my fault, even though the situation was clearly unfair. The breaking point came after about 8 months of living together. One weekend, I traveled to visit my parents and returned home 2 days later expecting a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into what looked like the aftermath of a massive party. Empty bottles covered the coffee table, the floor was sticky, and several people I had never seen before were still sleeping in the living room. When Brandon finally woke up, he acted as if nothing unusual had happened. He said the gathering had simply gotten out of control, and that he planned to clean everything later. That later never came. That moment made me realize I could not continue living in that environment. So the next morning I contacted the landlord and explained the entire situation, including the unpaid rent, the constant guests, and the damage to the apartment. I showed him bank records proving that I had been covering most of the expenses 4 months. After reviewing everything, the landlord agreed that the arrangement was not sustainable and offered to modify the lease so that Brandon would have 30 days to move out. When I told Brandon about the decision, he reacted with anger, accusing me of betraying him and making his situation worse. But by that point I had already spent months trying to fix problems that he refused to address. During the following weeks he packed his belongings slowly, while continuing to complain about how unfair everything was. Eventually, he moved out, leaving behind bags of trash, broken furniture, and stains that I had to clean myself. Once the apartment was finally quiet again, I realized how much stress had been building during those months living with someone who ignored responsibility, had turned my home into a place of constant frustration. And even now, whenever someone suggests sharing an apartment to save money, I remember that experience and think very carefully before trusting another person with something as important as my living space. Sometimes people say, I should have been more patient because Brandon was clearly struggling, but from my perspective, patience only works when both people are willing to respect each other and take responsibility for their actions. And after everything that happened, I still sometimes wonder if I could have handled the situation differently, or if removing him from the apartment was simply the only way to finally bring peace back into my life. My name is Damien, and about 4 years ago I was in a relationship that at the time I believed would eventually turn into marriage. The woman I was with was named Vanessa, and we had been together for almost 5 years when everything finally collapsed, in a way that forced me to see how blind I had been for a very long time. When we first met, Vanessa was the kind of person who seemed perfect on the surface. She was confident, social, and had a way of making everyone around her feel comfortable. We met at a birthday party for a mutual friend and ended up talking for most of the evening about work, travel, and the kind of future we both wanted at that time. I was working as a project coordinator at a construction company, and she worked in event planning, which meant her schedule was often busy but exciting. During the first 2 years of our relationship, everything seemed normal. We spent weekends going out with friends, traveling occasionally, and slowly building what felt like a serious partnership. She moved into my apartment after about a year, and we started sharing responsibilities like rent, groceries, and daily routines, which made our life feel stable and predictable. The first signs of trouble were so small that I barely noticed them at the beginning. Vanessa started becoming more protective of her phone. She would flip it face down whenever she set it on the table, and sometimes she would step into another room to answer messages. When I casually asked about it, she said she was coordinating events with co-workers and dealing with clients who often contacted her at strange hours, which sounded believable because her job really did involve unusual schedules. 4 months, I accepted that explanation without questioning it because trust was something I always believed was essential in a relationship. However, over time, the small details started adding up. Vanessa began coming home later from work, sometimes claiming she had to stay late to finish planning details for upcoming events. She also started spending more weekends, saying she needed to visit venues or meet clients. At first, I tried to be supportive because her career was important to her, but the emotional distance between us slowly became more noticeable. Conversations that once lasted hours started turning into short, distracted exchanges, and she seemed less interested in spending time together. Whenever I suggested going out, she often said she was too tired or too busy, but strangely, she always seemed to have energy when her friends invited her somewhere. Despite these changes, I kept convincing myself that relationships sometimes go through stressful periods and that things would eventually return to normal. The moment that changed everything happened on a random Tuesday evening. Had come home earlier than usual because a project at work had been postponed. When I walked into the apartment, Vanessa was in the shower and her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, vibrating repeatedly. I was not someone who normally checked another person's phone, but the constant buzzing caught my attention, and when I looked at the screen, I saw a message preview from a contact saved simply as Jared. The message said, "I missed last night already." When I read that, my heart dropped because the words immediately suggested something far more personal than a normal conversation. Curiosity and confusion pushed me to open the message thread, and what I saw confirmed my worst suspicion. The conversation contained months of messages between Vanessa and Jared, including plans for secret meetings, inside jokes about lying to me, and discussions about future weekends they planned to spend together. While I believed she was working, the messages revealed that the relationship had been going on for almost a year. I remember sitting there in complete silence, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and humiliation, because 4 months I had been defending her busy schedule while she had been building another relationship behind my back. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, But after a few minutes another idea formed in my mind. Instead of reacting emotionally, I decided I wanted to understand the full truth, and more importantly, I wanted her to reveal it herself. Over the next 2 weeks I acted completely normal, as if nothing had changed. I continued going to work, having dinner with her, and asking about her day, while quietly observing everything she did during that time. I also gathered evidence by taking pictures of the message conversations whenever her phone was left unattended, and confirming details about the places she claimed to visit for work. The more I looked, the clearer the situation became. Vanessa had created an entire second life that existed alongside the relationship she had with me. Eventually, I realized that confronting her privately would only lead to denial, excuses, and promises that meant nothing, so I decided to handle the situation in a way that would prevent her from twisting the story later. I organized a small dinner at the apartment and invited several close friends, including two people who had always been supportive of our relationship. Vanessa thought it was simply a casual gathering and spent the afternoon preparing snacks and drinks without suspecting anything. When everyone arrived, we sat in the living room talking and laughing. We had done many times before. After about 30 minutes, I stood up and said there was something important I wanted to share with everyone. Vanessa looked slightly confused, but still relaxed, because she assumed I was about to make some kind of announcement about work or travel plans. Instead, I connected my laptop to the television and opened a folder filled with screenshots of the messages between her and Jared. The room went completely silent as the messages appeared on the screen, revealing the truth about her secret relationship. Vanessa's face turned pale almost immediately, and she started trying to interrupt, claiming the messages were taken out of context, but the evidence spoke for itself. Several friends looked shocked, while others quietly avoided eye contact, realizing how serious the situation had become. After the final screenshot appeared, I calmly explained that the relationship between Vanessa and me was officially over, and that she would need to move out of the apartment by the end of the week, because the lease and furniture were all under my name. Vanessa began crying and accusing me of humiliating her in front of everyone, but I reminded her that the humiliation had started the moment she chose to lie for an entire year. Instead of being honest, that night ended with most of our friends leaving in silence and Vanessa packing a bag to stay somewhere else. Within a few days, she had moved out completely, and from what I later heard, her relationship with Jared did not last very long. Once the excitement of secrecy disappeared in the months that followed, some people told me exposing her like that was too harsh, and that I should have handled the breakup privately, while others believed that someone who lies for that long should not expect a quiet ending. Now, several years later, my life has moved forward in ways I never expected, but sometimes I still think about that night and wonder whether revealing everything in front of our friends was the right decision, or whether walking away quietly would have been the better path. Even though part of me still believes that after months of betrayal, the truth deserved to be seen by everyone instead of hidden behind another lie. My name is Colin, and a few years ago was supposed to get married to a woman named Melissa, and at the time I believed my life was finally reaching the point where everything would become stable and predictable. We had been together for nearly 4 years before the engagement, and during most of that time, our relationship seemed balanced and healthy. We met through co-workers at a small company networking event, where we ended up talking most of the evening about work, travel, and future goals. Melissa was energetic, social, and confident, while I was more quiet and practical, which at first seemed to create a good balance between us. She liked planning activities and meeting people, while I preferred calm routines and steady progress in life. Over time, those differences made our relationship feel exciting, because she encouraged me to step outside my comfort zone, and I helped bring stability to her sometimes chaotic schedule. Over about 2 years together, we moved into a small townhouse, and that was when our relationships started feeling more serious. We shared responsibilities, paid bills together, and began talking about long-term plans like buying a house and eventually starting a family. During that period, I truly believed Melissa was the person I would spend the rest of my life with. When I proposed during a weekend trip near the coast, She was overwhelmed with excitement. She cried, hugged me, and immediately started talking about wedding ideas and how beautiful everything would be. Our families were thrilled when we announced the engagement, and for the first few weeks the entire experience felt joyful. Friends congratulated us, our parents offered support, and Melissa began looking through wedding magazines and online galleries for inspiration. However, the moment we actually started planning the wedding, something slowly began to change in ways I did not fully understand at first. Melissa became extremely focused on every detail of the event, which seemed normal, because weddings involve many decisions about venues, decorations, music, and guest lists. But gradually her attention shifted from celebrating the relationship to creating an event that would impress as many people as possible. The guest list became our first major conflict. Originally, we had talked about inviting around 80 people, mostly close friends and immediate family, but Melissa began expanding the list to include distant relatives, co-workers she barely spoke to, and several people she described as important connections who might benefit our future social standing. When I asked why they needed to attend, she explained that weddings were social opportunities where appearances mattered, and that a large crowd would make the celebration feel more important. Eventually the list grew to almost 200 guests, many of whom I had never met before, and every time I suggested reducing the number, Melissa became frustrated, saying I did not understand how important these connections were to our family. The budget soon became another major issue. We originally agreed on a reasonable amount that both of us could afford comfortably, but Melissa quickly started adding expensive upgrades. She insisted on renting a luxury venue with elaborate lighting, decorations, a professional wedding planner, and a live band, instead of a smaller venue with a simple ceremony. Whenever I suggested choosing less expensive options, she accused me of not caring about the wedding and said this was the only time in her life she would get to experience such a moment. Her parents, especially her mother Diane, became deeply involved in these discussions and often supported Melissa's decisions. Diane frequently reminded me that weddings represent the reputation of the family, and that cutting corners would make the event look cheap. Despite my concerns, I kept telling myself that planning stress can make people behave differently, and that everything would calm down once the wedding was over. But over the following months, I noticed another strange pattern. Melissa became obsessed with documenting every part of the planning process on social media. She posted constant updates about dress fittings, cake tastings, venue tour, and decoration meetings, while describing how expensive and elaborate everything was. Many of the posts contained comments about how much work and money the wedding required, and although she presented them as jokes, they often hinted that guests should be generous with their gifts. At first I tried to ignore it, because I assumed she was just excited, but eventually I started feeling uncomfortable about the way she spoke about the event. One evening, about a month before the wedding, something happened that completely changed the way I viewed everything. I came home earlier than usual from work and overheard Melissa speaking with her mother in the kitchen. They were discussing the guest list while looking at a spreadsheet on her laptop. At first, it sounded like they were reviewing seating arrangements, but after listening more carefully, I realized they were estimating how much money each guest might give as a wedding gift. Melissa mentioned certain relatives who were known for giving large envelopes, while her mother suggested placing those guests closer to the main table so they would feel appreciated. They even discussed which friends might need subtle reminders about traditional wedding generosity. Hearing that conversation made me feel uneasy, because the wedding suddenly sounded less like a celebration and more like a financial plan. Later that evening, I asked Melissa directly about what I had overheard. She initially laughed and said I had misunderstood, but eventually admitted that many families keep track of wedding gifts to help offset the cost of large ceremonies. When I told her it felt manipulative, she became defensive and said I was being naive about how big celebrations work. The argument that followed lasted most of the night and ended without any real resolution, because the wedding was already approaching quickly and cancelling it would create massive embarrassment for both families. A few days later, another moment made my concerns even stronger. My best friend and best man called me sounding uncomfortable. He explained that Melissa had contacted several members of the wedding party, privately reminding them that the wedding had become extremely expensive and hinting that generous gifts would help make the event successful. Hearing that confirmed everything I feared, because it showed that the conversation with her mother had not been a misunderstanding. The wedding had become an event focused heavily on money, appearances and social reputation rather than the relationship itself. As the ceremony date approached, I felt increasingly anxious, but I kept hoping that once the celebration happened, things would return to normal. However, the night before the wedding I found myself unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the arguments, the financial pressure, and the way Melissa's priorities had shifted over the past year. I began imagining what our marriage might look like if the same patterns continued, every major decision becoming a battle about status, money, and appearances. Early the next morning, after hours of thinking, I finally made a decision that felt both terrifying and strangely clear. I told Melissa that I could not go through with the wedding. At first she thought I was joking, but when she realized I was serious, her reaction quickly turned into anger and disbelief. She accused me of destroying months of planning, humiliating her in front of hundreds of guests, and betraying her family. Her parents called repeatedly, demanding explanations, and saying that cancelling the ceremony so late would embarrass everyone involved, because by that point, nearly 200 guests were preparing to attend, and the venue staff were already setting up for the event. News spread quickly among friends and relatives, and reactions were divided. Some people said I had done the right thing because the situation revealed deeper problems that would only grow worse in marriage. Others believed I should have gone through with the wedding to avoid causing financial loss and public embarrassment for both families. Even now, more than a year later, I still think about that decision. Sometimes I wonder if I should have confronted the issues earlier instead of waiting until the final moment. But at the same time, I cannot ignore the feeling that the wedding planning process revealed truths about priorities and expectations that might have made our marriage extremely difficult from the beginning. Walking away that morning changed many relationships and caused a lot of anger in the short term, but it also forced me to confront what kind of life and partnership truly wanted for the future. And sometimes I still ask myself whether leaving the wedding at the last moment was an act of selfishness that hurt many people, or whether it was the only honest decision left. Once I realized the celebration had become something completely different from the relationship I thought we were building together. My name is Eric, and several years ago I believed my life was finally moving toward the future I had always imagined for myself. Was 32 years old, working as an operations manager for a logistics company, and after spending most of my 20s focused on building a stable career, had finally reached a point where life felt steady enough to start thinking seriously about family and long-term plans. Around that time, I was in a relationship with a woman named Claire, who at first seemed like the perfect partner for that next chapter. We had met through a mutual friend during a small dinner gathering where a few co-workers and old college friends were catching up and talking about life goals, careers and travel plans. Claire and I ended up sitting next to each other almost by accident, and within minutes we started talking in a way that felt unusually natural. The conversation moved easily from childhood stories to future dreams, and before the evening ended, we had already exchanged numbers and agreed to meet again. Within the first few months of dating, our connection felt strong and comfortable. Claire was thoughtful, funny, and seemed to share many of the same values I had about stability, honesty, and building a meaningful life together. We spent weekends exploring small restaurants, going on day trips outside the city, and slowly getting to know each other. Families and close friends. Over time, the relationship deepened, and after about 2 years, we decided to move in together. I had purchased a small house not long before we met, and inviting Claire to share it felt like the natural next step. The transition into living together went surprisingly well. We divided responsibilities, easily supported each other during busy periods at work, and developed routines that made the house feel like a true home rather than just a place to sleep. Friends often commented that we seemed like one of those couples who had quietly built a strong partnership without unnecessary drama, which made me feel confident that our future together would continue in the same direction. About 3.5 years into the relationship, Claire came home one evening looking both nervous and excited. She asked if we could sit down because she had something important to tell me. When she placed a pregnancy test on the kitchen table, my first reaction was complete shock, followed almost immediately by a powerful wave of emotion. Becoming a father had always been something I hoped for someday, but I had not expected it to happen so suddenly. Claire watched my reaction carefully because she had been afraid I might panic or feel unprepared. But instead I found myself smiling and laughing at the same time, because despite the surprise, the idea of starting a family with someone I loved felt like the beginning of something meaningful. That night, we stayed awake 4 hours, talking about what our future might look like. We discussed baby names, rearranging the spare room into a nursery, and how we would tell our parents the news. When we finally shared the announcement, both families were thrilled. Claire's mother became especially excited, talking constantly about how she would help once the baby arrived, while my parents immediately started planning visits and offering advice about raising children. During the first few months of the pregnancy, everything seemed normal. We attended a couple of doctor appointments together, bought a few small items for the baby room, and slowly began adjusting our daily routines around the idea that our lives would soon include a child. However, as the months passed, I started noticing small details that created a quiet and easy feeling that I could not fully explain at first. Claire became noticeably more protective of her phone. She had never been secretive before, but suddenly she kept it with her constantly and sometimes stepped outside to answer calls. When I asked about it, she said friends and co-workers were checking on her more often now, that she was pregnant, which sounded reasonable, but the pattern still felt unusual. Another change involved the medical appointments. At the beginning, I attended the first few visits with her. Gradually, she started saying that many of the later checkups were quick, and there was no reason for me to leave work early. She insisted she could handle them alone, and that I should focus on my job while she managed the pregnancy details. Even though I trusted her, something about being excluded from those moments began to bother me quietly. Over time, around the 5th month of the pregnancy, an unexpected moment completely changed everything. One afternoon, I was working from home and needed to print a document from the computer we shared. While searching through folders, I accidentally opened one that contained several saved screenshots and scanned files. At first I assumed they were medical reports related to the pregnancy, but when I looked closer I realized they were message conversations between Claire and someone named Lucas. The dates on the messages immediately caught my attention because they went back several months to a time shortly before Claire told me I was pregnant. As I continued reading, my chest tightened with every line. The messages showed that Claire had been meeting Lucas privately during that period. They talked about spending weekends together, making excuses to avoid suspicion, and laughing about how complicated things could become if anyone discovered their situation. What made my stomach drop completely was a message where Lucas asked if she was certain about the timing of the pregnancy, and Claire replied that she believed the baby was probably mine, but she could not be completely sure because the dates were close. Reading those words felt like the ground had suddenly disappeared beneath me. 4 months I had been imagining myself as a father, building emotional attachments to a future child without realizing that the situation might be far more complicated. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. The excitement that had filled my life since the pregnancy announcement was instantly replaced by confusion, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. That evening, when Claire returned home, I struggled to act normal, because part of me wanted to confront her immediately, while another part needed time to think about what I had discovered. After dinner, we sat in the living room, and I finally asked if there was anything she needed to tell me about the pregnancy. She looked confused at first, but when I mentioned the name Lucas, I saw the color slowly fade from her face. She tried briefly to say it was an old conversation that meant nothing, but eventually the truth started coming out piece by piece. She admitted that during a period when our relationship had been going through stress, she had briefly become involved with Lucas, a man she had met through a friend group. She insisted the relationship had been short and that she ended it quickly But when I asked the most important question, whether she knew for certain that the baby was mine, she hesitated before answering that she believed it probably was, but had never taken steps to confirm it, because she hoped everything would work out naturally. Hearing that response felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, because for months I had been preparing emotionally for fatherhood, buying small items, planning changes to the house, and telling family members that our lives were about to change. The idea that the child might belong to someone else, while I unknowingly built my future around that belief, felt deeply humiliating and painful. The argument that followed lasted almost the entire night. Claire cried repeatedly, apologizing and saying she had been afraid to tell me the truth because she thought I would leave her immediately. She said that once she realized she was pregnant, she hoped the baby would turn out to be mine, and that revealing the uncertainty would only destroy our relationship. But for me, the issue was not just the possibility that another man could be the father. The real betrayal was that she allowed me to live under that uncertainty for months without giving me the chance to make an informed decision about my own future. After several days of thinking about the situation, told Claire that the only path forward was to take a paternity test. As soon as the baby was born, she agreed. Although the atmosphere in the house changed completely during the remaining months of the pregnancy, the excitement that once filled the rooms was replaced by quiet tension. We rarely talked about the baby anymore, and every conversation felt cautious and distant. When the day finally arrived and the baby was born, the hospital staff arranged the paternity test. Shortly afterward, the waiting period for the results felt endless, because the outcome would determine not only the future of our relationship, but also the direction of my entire life. When the report finally arrived, it confirmed that the child was not mine. Claire broke down crying when she saw the results, while I felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions: relief that the uncertainty was finally over, sadness for the innocent child caught in a complicated situation, and anger at the months of dishonesty that had led us to this point. Shortly after leaving the hospital, Claire packed her belongings and moved out of the house. Eventually, she contacted Lucas and told him the truth about the child, and from what I later heard, he accepted responsibility and became involved in the child life. While our relationship ended completely, the experience left a lasting impact on how I view trust, honesty, and communication in relationships. Some friends later told me that fear can cause people to hide difficult truths, and that perhaps Claire had been overwhelmed by the situation. Others believed that allowing someone to build emotional attachment to a child while hiding the possibility of another father was a betrayal too large for any relationship to survive. Even now, years later, I sometimes find myself replaying those months in my mind, wondering if there were warning signs I ignored or conversations that might have changed the outcome. And sometimes I still ask myself whether walking away from the relationship after learning the truth made me cold-hearted, or whether protecting my future from a life built on uncertainty was the only decision that truly made sense in the end.